I don't want to teach Angular now, that's not the topic, but I'd like to share what issues I get, because basically I used Angular as part of my web app and it was not a single page app. So in this case, issues arise. Okay, so to begin with, I'd like to show you some of the main Angular paradigms. So basically, yeah, in Angular you don't play with the DOM, you don't play with selectors. That's what I like most. You are actually completely obtrusive because you write everything in the DOM. That DOM creation is data-driven and events are written in the DOM as well. So basically, it's completely obtrusive. Let's give some examples. I hope it's visible. So there are two examples how I would have done it in jQuery. So quickly, it's in CoffeeScript, and how it's done in Angular. Do you see what is written?
Not much. A bit.
No. That's a problem.
I can read, but
Yes.
not easily.
Yes, great.
Yeah, much better.
Okay, cool. Okay, so take the jQuery part. You have a div with a URL, an ID, another div. So results here, no results here. So you do your Ajax query, and here you begin to start conditional. So if you have messages, then you look on the data you've received, and you begin to append stuff on the selector here, which is the unordered list here. So it's very mechanical, and if you don't have any results, so you show an ID. In Angular, basically, in the controller you are interested in data, so you retrieve data, you assign them to the scope. That's all that you do. This is just a way to do the REST call. And then in the view, you define your rules. So I'm going to show this div if messages.length is more than 0. So it's completely written here in plain JavaScript. The same for here. ngHide, I will hide it if it's more than 0. So we have no conditionals here. And then I'm going to loop the messages here. It's an ng repeat. I'm going to take each message in the messages collection, and I'm going to display message.title. So it's pretty funny because the DOM here is very small. The DOM here is very talkative, I'd say. You can't know what the logic is if you only read the DOM here. It's pretty clear, at least to me, what happens here. And then you fetch the data. So I'm not here to sell Angular, but I like the way it's done. Another example with events. So basically in jQuery, you say, okay, so based on the ID, I create an event on click and it happens something happens. In Angular, you have a controller, and you say you have a function here, defined on the scope. And in the DOM, you say on click, trigger this method, and this method is defined in the controller. So again, the DOM tells you everything you need to know. So the way data is bound to DOM is clear in forms as well. So if you have a form, you give it a name. On submit, you want something to happen. Then the input here is a text, and you say, oh, there is ng model, it's product.name. So it's a way to create what is called a model in Angular, but it's just a JavaScript object. And then here you have a button, and you say it's disabled if the product form, so the form here is the name, is invalid. So again, it's very verbose, but it's kind of clear. And so here you have the save function. It's defined in the controller. So it's here. So then it's just a basic REST call. And the product, you set it by default to an empty JavaScript object. So this way, as soon as you begin to type in the input form, the product object, the product JavaScript object will be filled in. There are several, it's the basic Angular tutorial where you see that when you type, it's displayed elsewhere. It's one of the core features because of observers. So here I illustrate how the data is completely scoped to some DOM elements. So if you have a controller here, it manages this div and only this div, and another controller, it manages this div. So you can have the same variable names, but they will represent completely different data. So you avoid image collision this way. Some people are always scared of Angular because when you have your favorite jQuery plugin, you might say, oh, but I have to angularize it some way. So it's true, but basically it's not that difficult. In this case, it's just a matter of taking the select and call select eyes on it with some options. And in Angular, if you want to do it, it's one of the core rules in Angular. If you want to touch the DOM, you never ever do it in a controller. So here you have nothing to do with the DOM. Let's start with the final results. You have a select. You have select eyes here, which appears with apparently some options. And basically, select eyes is an attribute. This attribute is defined actually by a directive, which is called a directive in Angular. And when the DOM is passed, if this matches an existing directive, this code will be triggered. And skills options is defined in the controller, so it has a value. And we have the exact same behavior as before. Because the options here are defined here, they are passed here, and you have the exact same result. So it might, some people are scared because they don't know what directives really are, but it's not much code, and it keeps the full logic intact. You don't bother with the controller, with the DOM in controllers, and your DOM must be very explicit. So it's, yeah, basically a directive is either you have attributes and options, you can add as many options as you want, or you can even create your own DOM elements. But beware of Internet Explorer in this case. That's a problem. So I feel like this is fascinating because you create your own language in the DOM, which is something I really like because when you read, you almost understand what happens. And some people thought it's like HTML6 because you have new data attributes, and so some people try to push this idea, but yeah, it's not the case. So yeah, basically AngularJS is a nice framework to write modularized code. Everything is in small modules if you do it well. To create single page apps, I do it most of the time. But my talk is about, okay, you do single page apps, it works great, but if I have my Rails app, my good old Rails app, and I load my code, and I only want just Angular to handle some stuff on my pages, not the whole, here it's become very awkward. And I fought with those concepts, and here is what I learned. So basically, if you want to know if the user is logged in, it could be very handy in your client-side code. So you don't have the answer on the JavaScript side. You don't know it because the sign-in logic was not implemented in JavaScript, so it was done with device, for instance. So you don't know. So one of the solutions is to just put the information in the DOM. So using plugins like GON or just writing your object in the DOM, and it's pretty annoying. Basically, I hate that. It's one of the main limitations. You want to know something obvious from the client-side point of view, and because you have your server knowing and the logic is not, JavaScript doesn't know, you have to find ways to make it know. And I don't really like it. So you could trigger a dedicated Ajax call, but still it feels bad. I have no great answer for this. So forms here, it's maybe the most annoying stuff because we are, as Rails users, we are accustomed to use form for, and it creates our forms and data values are pre-filled if ever the user already filled in some fields. So let's say with sheer HTML, using Flash here, you'd say, okay, so I have input, ng model, and value, like Rails would produce. It just feels nice, but actually, from Angular point of view, the user is empty, nothing. So if you want to implement JavaScript logic, you can't use your form for. It's just pointless. And this is because, like most JS frameworks, doesn't want to go away, never mind. Angular expects data to come from within. So it would work perfectly fine if you are in the controller, the user defined this way, with email, the value, and name the value. So it doesn't read the value in the DOM, like your Rails app would produce. It expects it from the inside. So what does it mean for Rails developer? So if you need to leverage the ng model provided by Angular, your forms are completely screwed. Basically, it doesn't worth it. So there is a solution, but the solution is very awkward. It's just, okay, so you have your user data, and you just transform it into JSON, and you make Angular know those values. This way it could work. But yeah, it's really awkward, and it's pointless to use the form for because you don't use what is produced. So it's a problem. It's one of the limitations. So forms again. So finally you moved the logic to JSON, as I explained before. So you have your JSON object. And now you expect your form to work. That helps. We have an issue here. If ever you have a skills array like that, and your select in your form as a value like 0 and display Ruby, value 1 display JavaScript, this won't work because Ruby doesn't match 0 and doesn't match 1. So it's bad too. So it comes to a very simple problem when you need to send data to the client. Actually, you have to send it raw. So it should be 0 and 1 here. This way, the form will work, but now you need to have a way to display it properly. And to display it properly, here you can leverage. So you have to send 0 and 1. And if you want to display it properly, there are several tricks, but basically, if you look the skills of the user, you can add what is an angular filter here. And I haven't called it's there because that's not the added value of the talk, but it's not that difficult, and it just makes you realize that you work with raw data, so you must send raw data to the client, and if you need to actually display something human can read, you have to present it using, for instance, filters. There are several ways to do that, but filters are the most Angular-ish way. And it's still pretty readable for in the HTML. Okay, so now an issue with Rails. So how is it possible? Actually, if you send a post request to your user's controller and you send name, email, and skills. So if you look at params user, I was amazed, but it exists. There is nothing here, but it exists. But it only contains name and email. And this really confused me. And because I'm a developer and I'm too proud of myself to say I might be the issue, I really thought Angular was the issue, but it's not. Actually, it's Rails. I tended to trust Rails more than I trust JavaScript, but yeah, actually, it's Rails. But Rails is clever. It's clever. It says, okay, so you are sending data to the user's controller. Okay, so if some keys of your params match the attribute names of user, I just wrap them and put them in the user hash. Wow. Okay, I never believed it was the case. So only those matching attribute names, and the solution is to use the wrap parameters in your controller. So you can say, okay, you'll receive data. Please put them in the params user. I'm just going to give you the whitelist. So basically here I would have wrap parameters and user. No, it was name, email, and skills. In this way, it would be accepted. So yeah, in this very example, you could just rename skill IDs and it would work if you have an association, but you get the point. JS routing. So in order to interact sometimes in a more efficient manner on the clients, you need to use JS routing, but you have your application routing. So you can't have both living in the same place. So you have Rails handling this part, and then you have to do it another way to handle the rest. So you end up with hashes. And if you want to keep readable code in your JavaScript, you want to name it approximately what it's really doing. So you end up repeating what's before the hash. And if you have a two steps form, you would end up using user/user step 1 and step 2. So it's pretty ugly, but if you need JS routing on top of your Rails app, it's almost necessary. Yeah, the main issue is if someone hits /user/new, you must do something to route its client side to this state. So there is a way, but it really sucks. That's the way I did it in the very beginning. So afterwards I used directive, but that was my first shot. I was just hacking the location hash, and it worked, excepting IENF 9, where it's just produced an infinite loop. Basically, When you assign something to the hash in IE, it considers it's a page reload, so it reloads the page without the hash. The JavaScript gives the hash, and you just infinite loop. So yeah, this feels ugly, but if you need to access an abstract JavaScript state and you don't have a JavaScript app, single page app, you end up using those kind of apps.
I don't know if I can enter, but we used to play with rich client stuff, and I think I didn't work on it, but our guys in the end chose for those cases to do the redirect on the server.
The issue is that's why I wrote, if you want to keep your Rails, your standard rail routes. So yeah, it's doable, but servers are even not supposed to read hashes, they just ignore it. So when they receive it, they ignore it, so it's awkward too. I understand the point, but it's so awkward too.
It was kind of, his conclusion at that time, it was like the best way was to do it on the server. Because it is exceptional and people manually bookmark or handle.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, it's that you don't have your standard Rails routes anymore, so you can use your magic, like the magic Rails routes redirect to user. You have to user pass, user, and add the params or the hash. So it's doable, but you skip, you at the cost of the Rails routing cost. At the cost of Rails routing.
Question, I don't know if this some hash part is a Angular requirement, but can't you just rewrite the URL with JavaScript?
You could.
Won't that make it better? So instead of users new, you just rewrite it and with JavaScript, say users new step one.
And that's what he's doing there.
No, he's adding a hash to the end of the
Yeah, it's just
location,
adding
but
the hash, yes, exactly.
replacing the path name of the URL.
The issue is when you reload the page, the URLs that won't know the path, and it will crash.
What do you mean? If you replace the path to users new step one and then you reload the page, then your Rails can already see that it's on step one and you present.
Yeah, but it's not an action in Rails. It's an abstract state in JavaScript.
But then set users new to point to the users controller new and everything that's after it. JavaScript can, Angular can read from the path and figure out what.
You can. You can, but again, it's you are still doing awkward stuff. So I moved the awkward stuff here. I could have done it the way you described. I feel like it could have worked, but it's just weird code on the Rails part, and I don't feel comfortable having weird code on the Rails part because I'm using client-side code.
Okay.
So the point to use this is to have a hash. The hash doesn't mess with the Rails code at all.
Okay.
And yeah, it's ugly to have the repetition in the URL, but it was the cost I accepted to pay. But I agree, your solution will work.
Okay, but why didn't you just put the hash as step one without the users new? What was the logic?
Yeah, you could do it, but
so
just
to get rid of the repetition.
Yeah. But if you write your code and you have two forms and with two steps on, it might be handy to know with step one for what exact state is it. And it's clearer when you write code. Yeah, again, it could be changed, but yeah, pros and cons. Get request parent. So this is something which really sucks. If you send something clean like get request with those params, so a filter with two values, the server side will only receive parent filter, but this will be a string, a JSON string. So you have to parse it, and it's very good. there is no current solution. I was just fed up to have to do that. Just so you know. Yeah, to conclude the hard time I had with Angular when I wanted to use it as an addition to Rails. So yeah, don't use the Angular's core router. Use the UI router, it's a plugin, and it's the de facto standard now. Most of the community uses it, and it will be soon merged in the Angular core. Don't use the Angular's low-level resource. This service is very low-level, and it's a pain to work with. There are more cool stuff to work with, like REST Angular. Don't use callbacks, use promises. So it's not something we are familiar with when we work with Rails as a daily basis. And again, because we use Rails, we see everything as objects, but it's maybe the most difficult part when you enter Angular or any JavaScript world. It's that you have to think in a very different manner. So for single page apps, actually I didn't have many issues. It was quite straightforward. Yeah, because as I already told you, the weird situations stem from trying to make the server dictate the client what to do, but the browser is is JavaScript garden, so. And that's it. Do you have any questions? Do you want more details? Do you want me to show you some examples? Feel free.
Angular versus Ember.
I don't know. It's, yeah.
How did you choose?
I feel like, actually, originally, I didn't want the application to be a single page app, and Angular is well designed for single page apps, but it seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, I haven't really dug it since, it seems that either you adopt Ember as a whole and it dictates everything, or you don't. You can't really use some parts to play with. So I use Angular in order to only add some add-ons to my pages, so client-side features. But yeah, you saw the cost. So yeah, that's the way I chose.
Other question? How do you do integration best?
It's Karma, I think, from Angular.
I do use Selenium and Capybara.
Okay, the whole thing together.
Yeah, exactly, and it works like integration test works. It's not better, it's not worse, it's as always random. Yeah, so not much surprise here. Capybara is waiting for selectors to appear. So even for the single page app I write test with Capybara and Selenium, and it works. It works.
Just that the Karma stuff seems to be much faster.
Yeah, it's dedicated to this purpose, but my issue is that I have my Rails server serving the HTML. So I needed to do it some way. So maybe I should switch to, download maybe Node to have all the JavaScript encapsulated, but I don't have plain HTML templates.
If we have time, maybe a concrete example of where you used particular for doing some interactivity or client-side stuff?
Yeah, okay.
Could be some-
I'm going to think about a quick example I could show you after Christophe.
After me?
Yeah,
You
but
can do now.
I have to think.
Okay.
Because then, to make it concrete, my extra question would be, in that specific case, like, would you still, looking afterwards, would you still use Angular or just say, okay, just for maintenance, just to plain old interactivity with a little bit of jQuery?
My main concern with jQuery is that you end up with a situation where you need to load code, but you have to handle when and how. So the how could simply be I insert this JavaScript file only in this view, so it handles everything. So it's a way to do it, but it completely defeats the purpose of the ASP pipeline. So that's not a great solution to me. There are maybe other options I will ignore, or maybe testing if selectors exist in the page, and if they exist, I can execute the function with jQuery code. But it seems terrible to me that something could rely on selectors. Yeah, maybe we should just write an example.
Yeah, so I think it's probably going to be more interesting to have a discussion if you have a concrete example.
I'm going to think about it. Do you have a topic to give to me?
No, but you can take in something from the project, maybe you have something.
Yeah, I have to think about it, so I can sort out what's really relevant. Okay.
Thanks. So, well, I won't talk so much about code, but more about something I've seen a lot in the community, is the way people compare different implementation to decide which one is the best, is the most performant, and that makes me quite sick, because they base all their decision on something that is wrong, and at the end they think they did the good decision, but in fact it's not necessarily the case. So I just want to introduce something from some things from the statistics, and to raise the level at that point. That's about me and Christophe and so on. So usually,
What you could do is just change the resolution.
yeah,
If you put it on,
I don't know what to do.
can I?
Yeah, sure.
it's not my computer, so
If you go into the settings, go into the settings.
just press Alt Option F1 or there was something here.
Yeah, but on Mac I don't know. Arrangements, display scale. Display, you have to do the scale there. That's it. Scale to 20p will probably be a lot better.
Yeah, great. Is it perfect?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Okay. The green button, green click, red task.
Okay. So usually that's the common thing you can do to prepare different implementation. Here just three ways to do a loop, and use the benchmark module. And yeah, simply what the benchmark module is, it runs each block, and for each block it measures the user time, system time, then it takes the total time, and also it reports the real time was taken to run the whole things. So, and people after that say, okay, that one is the best because we take a very large number to run the loop. So because the total is the lowest one, that means that block is the best. But it's not necessarily true. Why? Because here what you do is you sum you sum all your you sum the repetition, and in fact what you have is an average, and it's not because your average is different that necessarily it's significantly different. What I mean by that is that you run things on a computer and there could be different conditions to run your different implementation, that one thing, but also you're not sure how is distributed the time needed by your implementation. What I mean is, maybe with a graph it would be easier. If you have the time on Y and you put the distribution of your time needed by your implementation, you could expect to have something like that, but most of the people think we would have something normal. And you expect that finally the total is representative of the in average, the time needed to run your implementation. But you make a very big assumption, is that you have a normal distribution of your time, and it's not necessarily true. So you need to get rid of that and consider another way, because in fact what you could have, you could have other kind of distribution like that, and when you take the average, you will have something at the center, but it's not representative of what you think it should be. And if you compare with other implementation, with other distribution over the time, it's like comparing apple and pears. So that's not good. Yeah, that's the point. So we don't know the distribution of the time for your implementation. That's one thing, and the other thing is that you measure time, and it's positive. So in fact, a normal distribution is infinite, and if you have an average, like I don't know, 0.5 seconds, and your standard deviation is about 1 second, could happen because you don't have a normal distribution. In fact, that means you could have a negative time to run your implementation, and that's not true. That's not possible. So there are other tools that that allow you to deal with those cases, and I will give you a word about that. And the other thing is not because the difference is big that necessarily is significant. You could have a difference, but that doesn't mean that the implementation is always better. It could just because in the most trivial case, indeed, your average is different, but your distribution are quite the same. Or worse, you could have another distribution over time, where you have a normal one for that one, and because you have a very big peak and a low one there, the average for the second one is lower. But when you run an implementation, you're also interested in the worst cases, not only in the average. So you cannot just take the total as is. You need to have an idea of how the things are distributed over the time. This is most important. That's why usually the monitoring systems, the best one, give you the 19% percentile because you are more interested in the worst case than in the average. So, and it's not because you run the things a lot of time that again it will make you. In fact, if you have a big sample size, so if we boost that number, it's a way to boost the difference. So in fact, you will make the illusion is better, but it's not necessarily the case again, because usually the difference depends on the sample size. And also, what's important is what do you want to test. It's not because, okay, I will test something, I will run the things, and I will just measure the total and compare it. But what you want to test, is it the worst case? Is it that you want to compare the best case or maybe the average? You need to state before running the things, you need to state what you want to measure. Because if you don't do that, you don't know how to interpret your data. So I've started to implement an extension of the module benchmark, and the idea is to bring to Ruby developers a lot of statistical tools that resolve all the things I've underlined. So if we took just our first example, the most important difference is that you need to give how many times you want to run the things. So that will, in fact, decide what's your sample size. And then what is reported is different things. First, for each time, you will get a median and a first and a third quartile. So what they are, just to remind you. The median on a normal distribution is the same as the average. It's the value for which that split the distribution in half. So you know that before that value, you have 50% of all the other values before. And the first quartile is the same, but for the first 25%. And the third quartile is for the 75%. So with that, you have a good idea how where is the center of your distribution and how it's spread. So even if it's not a normal, it would be it gives you a better insight than the average and the standard deviation. So that's the three numbers you have there each time. And the last thing is that I will tell you which one is the best one, and if it's significantly better or not. And in that case, even if there are some difference, I can tell you that it's not significantly different. Significantly better. So you cannot draw any conclusion on that. You cannot say, okay, that's the best one. You need to maybe go deeper and to study how exactly is distributed the result for each implementation to understand exactly their behavior. So yeah, why median and quartiles? Because they are good for what we called non-parametric statistics. So a normal distribution is a parametric distribution because you give two parameters to define the distribution, an average and a standard deviation. A non-parametric is just, you don't do any assumption. You know there are some distribution, but you don't know its form. That's it. And because they are the good measure to tell you how is central your distribution and how it's distributed. Yeah, that's a strong name, but just for, you know, when at a party, if you can place it, it's great. No, so that's the idea of that test. Yeah, there are different statistical tests, and their role is to test. Usually, you say, okay, I would like to test two distribution, and I want to know if the mean of the first one is equal to the second one. That's what we know, what we call null hypothesis. So in our case, what we would like to know if it's one implementation is better than the other. Because we don't know if it's normal distribution, we need to go to non-parametric test, and there are some tests like this one. What it does is it will test the rank of your implementation. So if you have a rabbit and a turtle, and you just measure the time that needs each rabbit and each turtle to do a certain distance, you can rank them and say, okay, rabbit, 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 turtle, turtle, rabbit, rabbit, turtle, turtle, turtle. Yeah, that's great. So that's the first one, that's the last one. And so what the tests do, we just rank the results, and then thanks to that ranks, it can draw a conclusion to say, okay, the rabbits are better than the turtles. So I don't go deep into the details, but that's the basic behind. And it's perfect for comparing implementation and algorithm, because what you have is implementation 1, 2, and 3, and you will rank all those 3 implementation, and you want to know which one is the bestly ranked. So that's perfect for that. So yeah, in the future I would like also put other stuff, like, you know, in benchmark you have the BMBM. So you could, because you run the things in a certain order, the garbage collector could have an impact on your runtime. So the idea of the BMBM is it will run once the benchmark, doesn't measure anything, and then it runs again the benchmark, and then it measures the things, and you can trust that result. And there are other ways to do that, like randomizing the different runs, so you don't have any bias, and also to run up the garbage collector, because it will have an impact also on your runs. So there are other different stuff to do. Yeah, and so the idea is to bring a real benchmark to the Ruby community. Don't ask people to understand statistics, but at least to have something you can trust and you can use when you need to benchmark the things. So, well, the things that I would like to ask, if you think it's interesting, I mean, do you benchmark a lot of things? And in that case, what the things you expect usually, what the kind of question you state?
No, I don't benchmark that often because I try to make my program works first. so no, not really, because you also have to think about the data that you will put in your benchmarks. Your algorithms could run faster, significantly faster with some data, and run slower with others. So you have to analyze inputs and outputs too. It's really complex actually. So
this type of benchmark is also focused on algorithmic complexity.